we were pitching to a hotel that had 25 hotels across Australia and New Zealand. And before we'd even started, before we'd done our first mobile key, they took a sledgehammer to every single reception across all 25 hotels. Basically, their rationale was based on your product, we're just not going to need them anymore. I am being literal here, that they did destroy all of their receptions. So there was a huge amount of pressure at that point to actually deliver on what we said that we could do. There was no fallback option for them or us. These locks should be able to be installed by anyone. So the receptionist should be able to install them. You're not going to be able to get a locksmith in during the pandemic. Constraint is a good thing. And I think the pandemic helped us in that respect. I mean, I can say now that I believe our locks are the easiest locks to install on the market. I think the 3 shifts that I would be quite confident about moving into the future is
property management at scale is about more than just rent rolls and maintenance calls. It's about protecting your assets, delivering stellar guest experiences, and scaling operations without losing quality. Welcome to Minute by Minute, the show where industry leaders share unfiltered stories, proven strategies, and real solutions for operating at scale. I'm your host, Nils Mattisson, CEO of MΗNUT, and together we will dive deep into what it really takes to keep your properties safe, efficient, and protected. Let's get started. Today I'm joined by Jack Bowcott, founder of Portal and CEO of Goki, 2 companies focused on rethinking how people experience buildings, from access and check-in to the broader relationship between guests, operators, and physical space. For the past decade, Jack has been building technology that sits at the intersection of hospitality, product design, and IoT. Through Goki, he helped pioneer app-native guest access in hospitality, and with Portal, he's now addressing a much bigger challenge: upgrading the way buildings themselves function in a world that is increasingly expecting seamless, digital-first experiences. In this conversation, we'll explore the evolution from Goki to Portal, the trade-offs between automation and human hospitality, what it takes to introduce new infrastructure into legacy buildings, and where Jack believes hospitality and real estate tech are heading next. Jack, welcome to Minute by Minute. It's great to have you here.
Thank you for having me.
We always like to kick off with our guests' journeys. You've spent over a decade building technology around how people experience hospitality. What first pulled you into this problem, and how did that path lead from Goki to launching Portal?
Yeah, I mean, the origin story is quite interesting, actually. The very first thing we did was a dating app for travelers, believe it or not. So it's kind of a crazy start to the business. We were called TP back then. And as I say, it was kind of like a Tinder for travelers style app. And the mobile check-in function that we built for that application was actually how we got people to download the app. So it's like a reluctance to pay $1.50 on Facebook to get people to install the app. We just built mobile check-in. And what happened is when you had TP on your phone, you could literally scroll through profiles and see who else is staying at the same hostel as you at the same time, and you could say hello. And it was a little bit of a crazy app, because it's not like backpackers need a lot of encouragement to meet other backpackers. It was like pouring petrol on a fire, if you will. But where we went from there, we had some very interesting learnings from TP and from doing a social network, is that we quickly learned that the bigger problem wasn't really this side of the counter, the guest side of the reception counter. It was really on the other side. So we could see that staff were having to do a lot of repetitive tasks in their day-to-day job, working in this backpacker hostels, and that the business themselves wanted to find a way to be more operationally efficient. So they were leaning in more to the mobile check-in, whereas we were just using that as a kind of marketing channel. And eventually what happened is we started to think how we could properly close the loop on a guest journey. So what does staying in a backpacker hostel involve? And where that led us was like, okay, how can you check in, pay, and get your keys prior to arrival and avoid some of those massive queues that you might see at a hostel? And that actually led to some conversations with a big design agency called Design and Industry. And we started making devices, and we started actually really just closing the loop on how you arrive and how you check in. So the original pain point, in answer to your question, Bills, is that we were encouraging backpackers to be more social initially, but we quickly discovered a kind of higher ceiling, which was, how can we make hotels smarter? And subsequent to that, how can we make guests happier?
That's so interesting, Jack. Thank you for sharing. I didn't know that origin story. Can you talk about how Goki then relates to Portal, and what are the sort of differences between these two platforms?
Sure. I mean, from those humble beginnings of a social network, we built Goki, which is quite a big system, actually. It does three core areas of work, of automation for a hotelier. So we help guests check into the property, we help them access their rooms, and then we also help hotels communicate more effectively with the guests during their stay. So, and typically that involves direct moves for ancillary revenue centers. But with Portal, we focus purely on the access components. We're not doing check-in, we're not doing guest communication, we're just doing access. And Portal is heavily focused on the infrastructure. So we don't just work with our own devices, we work with any device. And again, it's following that same trend of eliminating repetitive tasks, making properties more operationally efficient, but it's doubling down on where the guest expectation is today, which is a seamless journey. And an acknowledgement that in that queue to check in, there's different personas who want different things. And hopefully what we're doing is giving some greater optionality to guests.
So is it fair to say that it's like a natural evolution from hospitality into like a broader built environment? Would that be right? Have I understood it correctly?
Yes, I would say so. I mean, I think one way of putting it is that we started off trying to make hotels smart. And with Portal, we're looking at more how we can make a building smart, or even any space at all. And with each of those iterations over the years, what we've had to do to facilitate that is add a greater level of kind of flexibility in the platform, in the technology. So what eventually happens is you become kind of vertical agnostic. So you don't have to work in a hotel or student living or a residential development. You can really make an impact in any of those environments. And I think looking back, there were kind of some very specific limitations that pushed us into that area. So with Goki, we have the hardware constraint. We don't do hardware in Portal. So essentially, we were a good hardware company, award-winning hardware company with software, but that meant all the manufacturing, inventory, shipping, installations, which are very capital-intensive costs. It doesn't scale in the same way the software does. I'm sure you're aware.
Painfully so.
Yeah. And then secondly, we kept getting pulled into adjacent markets. So student housing would have different requirements, or build-to-rent developers and so on. You kind of get the idea. And we kept facing that same kind of fundamental problem, which was, legacy locks, fragmentation, poor guest or tenant experience. And our hospitality-focused product didn't quite fit. But third, I mean, just to kind of look ahead briefly, and because this is where I think the exciting part of what Portal could be is that AI is fundamentally changing how bookings happen. I mean, already now you can go onto ChatGPT, you can kind of discover what you might want to do. You can even book and pay for what you might want to do. So ChatGPT, Google's AI assistant, WhatsApp-based booking bots, all of these things are coming around that weren't there 10 years ago when we started. But I still think there's a fundamental disconnect between that digital commerce and physical access. You can go through ChatGPT, but you can't get your physical key. And that's where Portal wants to be one day.
Of course, like in real estate, there is maybe like a bigger lag between what the sort of frontier technology is and what people actually have installed and what people are experiencing day to day. How do you think of like access and building infrastructure, and how do you sort of overcome that like large gap between what's installed today versus what is actually possible to build?
Yeah, I mentioned it a moment ago. I mean, fragmentation is obviously quite a big thing in hospitality, all the different systems that are being used. And sometimes you've got to look beneath that to see the wood for the trees, right? So once that begins to dissipate, the test that I use is, does these problems with hospitality versus buildings, do they exist because of how humans interact with the physical space, or are they because of a specific industry or operational? So an example of that. So check-in friction, I would say, is a building problem, right? It happens in hotels, apartments, offices, co-working spaces. But upselling some sort of room service, that's a hospitality problem. So what we're doing with Portal is we're trying to focus on building problems because they're universal and they're massive. They're massive problems that need solving. Every building in the world needs access control. So these solutions just happen to look slightly different depending on what the use case actually is.
And when trying to modernize these like fragmented portfolios with legacy systems, like where is the friction? Like what is the kind of problems that you encounter with implementation?
Yeah, I mean, look, I think a few things get in the way of that ultimate goal of implementation. Mechanical robustness is a good one. As sunk costs. I mean, the reality is a lot of these. If you don't mind, I'll call them dumb locks. They're not smart, but they are super mechanically robust. You can kind of put them on a bunker and they'll be there in 30 years still working, but they don't actually give operators the experience they want. They can't help you go contactless. And the reality is that buildings have invested a huge amount of money in this existing infrastructure. And owners aren't looking just to rip them off and chuck them in the bin. They just want those existing dumb locks to be smart. And that's exactly what we can do at Portal. And that leads on to the other sort of main point, which is the CapEx barrier. Hotels want to go contactless, but they can't afford to replace or even upgrade their locks in some experiences. I mean, I don't know if you're aware, but locks do cost about $750 to $1,000 a pop, right? They're expensive. So if you think about a 500-room hotel paying that much, there's a $500,000 decision up for grabs there. And most buildings simply can't justify it, so they stick with what they have. And I think that the final point that I would make in terms of the barrier to implementation is that there's an integration issue. There's an integration nightmare, you might want to say, and that a typical hotel's got, property management system at the center of the operation. They've got a booking engine, they've got a door locking system, maybe a guest app. You get the idea. But none of these were necessarily designed to talk to one another. So getting them to work together has traditionally kind of involved expensive middleware or months of integration work. So I think a good analogy here is perhaps what Square did with payments. Because we're trying to do the same thing with making access contactless. They made payments contactless. We're doing the same kind of thing. But they didn't rebuild tills, right? They didn't rebuild payment tills. They retrofitted a smart device and made payments contactless. So we're doing the same thing, retrofitting legacy or dumb locks, and hopefully bringing kind of modern convenience to that existing infrastructure.
Yeah, I remember the first Square reader that communicated through the headphone port of
Yes.
an iPhone. So I love that sort of image in terms of like you're using something that it wasn't designed for to sort of bridge where you want to be and what the infrastructure you had to work with. Are there similarities on the access side?
Yeah, I think so. I mean, if you look at one of our products we built in Portal, it's actually a small chip. Looking at the markets here, there's some very fancy new cloud-based API locks on the market, but most of them, so let's say around 90% or even more than 90%, are these old locks that don't really speak to systems. And I think that's a similar problem that Square were facing. But rather than going, hey guys, all these hospitality operators, you've got to buy expensive new till, they just created that terminal point that spoke to the till. And that's exactly what we do. We call it an API connector. It's a chip that we put inside a legacy lock that basically makes these old dumb locks the same as the fancy new cloud-based API locks. So you can facilitate things like web applications. So instead of saying to a guest, hey, download an app and you can use your phone as your key, you can message them access. You tap that, you open it in your existing browser. It's a more frictionless form of access. And honestly, it's exactly the same as Square in that respect. You're tapping your phone to buy a coffee, you're not using an old till.
Do you remember, it's probably 10 years ago, but I lived in San Francisco at the time and I knew some of the people at Square. And for a while they had this product where instead of tapping your phone, you had Square on your phone, like the app.
Yes.
And then when you walked into a coffee shop, a picture of you came up on the screen for the barista, and they could essentially charge you without you having to do anything. And I don't actually know why that product then didn't really take off, but I really liked it because it became completely transparent. And I would assume that it has to do with people actually wanted to tap their phone. It was maybe like too futuristic, and you have to take people on this journey. Is there something similar in Access where maybe it's possible for you to build something where you could just walk straight in, but people actually don't want it?
Well, it's funny. Think about the last holiday you went on, not necessarily traveling for business, but a holiday, and think about all the touch points you had with your phone during that trip. So for me, I would probably work out what I want to do, where I want to go on my phone. So the discovery part's done. And ultimately, you're probably going to go to booking.com, you're going to book, and then you're going to, tap at the plane to get your boarding pass, and you're going to get an Uber along the way. You're going to tap your phone to get food as well. And, but the problem that we've got in my industry with hotels is that really the hotels where that whole process gets taken down a notch, because you've tapped your phone everywhere the entire way from leaving the house to arriving at the hotel. And then when you arrive at the hotel, often you're met with a kind of long queue after a long flight. And the end point is receiving a plastic key card. And that probably shouldn't be happening, right? So really what we're trying to do is just to bring the hotel experience to the same level as everything else you did on that trip. And that's starting to change now. Like, certainly there's an acknowledgement that there's different people in the queue that need different options. And when I'm traveling with my family, I don't mind queuing up and finding out about the hotel and maybe having one of those little orange cocktails and all the rest of it. But when I'm traveling for business, I do want to bypass that experience altogether. And so what we're doing with Portal isn't replacing everything with robots, right? So we understand there's a very personal part to hospitality. We're not trying to move away. But what we are trying to do with Portal is at least give people the options to bypass it if they want to.
I think that sounds excellent. There's nothing more frustrating than being jet lagged and super tired from traveling, yes. And then you check into a hotel and they insist you must have a drink before you get your key. I've never understood that part.
Yes.
Is there a risk here that as an industry we are crossing into over automation and doing too many things transparently without having the human touch along the way?
Well, and I think it's an interesting question. I think the way that I think about it is that sometimes this is more of an operational consideration than one that relates to technology. And I'll give you an example of that. Sometimes I receive phone calls from like a motel owner in America, and they ring me and they go, "Oh, I can just play golf all day now. Like, your system's awesome. I don't have to do anything that I used to do." And if you were speaking to him, like, there's no level of over automation that he's not going to enjoy, right? But because that is a staffless operation that is fully reliant on a system automating everything for him. But let's look at hospitality in a more general sense, because a lot of hotels have built up a lot of brand equity in how they welcome guests. And in those situations, there is such a thing as over-automation. I mean, I think what you've got to look at is automating anything transactional, automating any of these sort of repetitive tasks that staff have to do. And then you have to not automate any of the human connection parts. So a potential example of that is what's possible when technology is leveraged in the right way. And think about what happens when you go and buy an iPad at Apple. There is technology in the background doing the heavy lifting. You can't necessarily see it, but what that's managed to facilitate for Apple is no counters between the staff and the guests. You walk in and it all kind of feels effortless. And I would say that's a perfect thing that we should be driving for in hospitality, because what happened there is technology has removed a lot of the boring, admin-heavy, antiquated stuff and allowed a more human connection between the guests and the staff. And I think that's what we're driving towards.
It's been a bit of a theme on the podcast where it seems like there are these two paths. One is like this completely automated, staffless, maybe a bit autonomous hotel, which I think there is a place for, right? Like there are times maybe when you're traveling for business, or you just want to have the highest level of convenience, and you actually maybe want it to be a little bit repetitive so that you know what you're going to get when you arrive at your place. But then, and you can use automation for that, and you can use tech to basically remove people almost altogether. But on the other hand, if you start automating aspects of the guest journey, you might be freeing people to actually add touch points that actually make a bit more sense. So that theme, I think, we'll see more of in the coming years.
And I think that's interesting, actually, that you say that, because I do think of Portal not as a way to replace people, but as a way to release them or free them, as you said, from admin. And that's the pattern that I see working. Sort of technology handling the kind of predictable and repetitive part, and humans focusing on the less predictable, more emotional, more creative parts of helping people to enjoy their stay. And just to double down on what we mentioned a moment ago, I think the moment that you start automating to avoid human contact rather than enhance it, that's probably when you've gone too far to the other side. I mean, I have stayed at properties in China where every single touch point was a screen. And as a tech guy, I really enjoyed it. I'm not going to go wrong. You check in at a kiosk and a robot delivers things to you, and there's a chatbot concierge, and there was no human speaking to me during my entire stay. So as a tech guy, I found that incredibly impressive,
Mhm.
but also simultaneously emotionally quite hollow. And I'm not sure if that's an experience that would be enjoyed by people outside of technology, right? So that's kind of my basic view on it. Let's free people from the boring stuff, so the guests have a better time.
Yeah, I once stayed in one of these capsule hotels in Shenzhen.
Yes,
Have you tried that?
yes,
And it
yes,
was exactly like you said. You book online. Me not speaking any Chinese, you barely understand what you're doing. But then there's a code, and it's almost like a one of these like cabinets where you can put your coat in a museum or put your backpack in a museum. It was
yes,
that experience, but it was for
yes,
yourself. And I didn't
yes.
go back, to be honest.
Do you know what? There's a funny story in Hangzhou. I was with a whole lot of people from China, and the robot came up to check us in. And the robot was clearly only trained to speak to Chinese people. So actually, I was trying to converse with this robot, and it kept turning around and running away from me. And there is actually video footage of me chasing a robot down a corridor to actually check in. But yeah, no, it's a funny kind of story of how technology can go too far. And we have to remember that hospitality at its heart is actually making sure there's a human-to-human connection and people having a good time. Unless, of course, with a capsule hotel, the brand promise is very laid out ahead of arrival, right? This is about removing friction. This isn't about us making you have a better stay. It's about you getting in and out quickly as efficiently as possible.
Yeah, I think there's room for a lot of different types of accommodation, and I think there's a time and place for cheap and efficient as well. Um, you've won multiple design awards for hardware, which being a hardware entrepreneur myself, I'm very impressed by. Um, you have, it seems, like moved maybe like a little bit away from the hardware side, but like when you were doing it, like what was the things where you found interesting trade-offs between like aesthetics, security, and operations,
Yes.
especially in hospitality?
I mean, I guess by trade, I am actually a designer. So it's something that I take very seriously. Like we've always been super inspired by companies like Apple and Airbnb, which I think show what's possible when you take design very seriously. But I think also there was the reality that while we were building these products, the pandemic happens. That was quite a big thing. So at the time, a lot of hotels were either shut or running on super skeletal staff, right? And so when we spoke to the design industry, the industrial designers that we work with, and they've done crazy things like submarines for Cameron to look at the Titanic, and barbecues for Heston Blue as well, all sorts of crazy things, and our locks. The brief to them as part of our design was that these locks should be able to be installed by anyone. So the receptionist should be able to install them. You're not going to be able to get a locksmith in during the pandemic. So as often is the case with good design, I believe, is that constraint is a good thing, and I think the pandemic helped us in that respect. I mean, I can say now that I believe our locks are the easiest locks to install on the market. And when we talk about other things you mentioned, you said security. I think there's a hierarchy with hardware devices that facilitate access, and that hierarchy would be security's got to be first. That is the point of a lock, right? And then the reliability comes in second, and aesthetics. Much as I might like that to be number one, is third. Like a beautiful lock that fails is a liability, right? But in practice, what that meant was obsessive testing and prototyping. Lots having to work when they're offline, and needing to function at scale. We process 4 million opens every single month, over 4 million opens every month. So, things like battery life and hospitality environments. And, if I might be able to just tell you a quick story of the first locks that we produced during the pandemic, the smart lock. It was funny, actually, because I have young children, and I was watching a lot of Marvel at the time, particularly Iron Man. And I had this idea that, like Iron Man's got this sort of little fusion reactor thing here that kind of powers him. I was like, we're going to bring that into the lock. We're going to do that. So we had these discs that you could pop in and out of locks, and they were the brain of the lock, like the fusion reactor. And I was just like, no, this is awesome. This is definitely the coolest lock ever. But what actually happened is that the housekeeping order, they might be sort of clumsily removed and put back in to charge the batteries. And if they weren't properly seated, it created all these connectivity issues, and then guests couldn't get in the room. So what started off as a sort of super cool idea, I still think it's a cool idea. Actually, there's got to be a level of dullness in hardware design. I think you can't go too crazy. Our Smart Lock Pro today, you can't remove the disc. It is hardwired into there, and you can't remove it. And I think boring but bulletproof has become a bit of a mantra at Goki, whereas clever but fragile might have been how you describe the Iron Man iteration. So it shows it's an iterative process with design, as you know.
Yeah, I can recognize that in many ways. I like sort of the first generation of a new product, because you can always see that the engineers and the designers have been quite ambitious, and then you get some gray hairs, and then you like anything that moves that can be removed, we remove. You make things mechanically simpler. We have a mechanically simple product at MΗNUT, but we've still had times when we have had issues with lenses and manufacturers, and you end up in a place where you design almost as little as possible, just to make sure that the function is what it's supposed to be. So did you manufacture out in China during the pandemic?
Yes, we did. Most of the engineering was done in Sydney with design industry, but of course, all of the assembly was done in China. To be honest, we didn't find that to be a big challenge, really, at the time. We've had periods where there's been shortages of chips. We've had periods where there's been embargoes from Wi-Fi modules being sent from the States to China. Those have been bigger hurdles than actually getting things off the production line in China during the pandemic. The one thing that we did, which was maybe a little bit crazy looking back, is we added this additive to the paint that meant germs couldn't live on the surface. And we did that very quickly. We turned around the repaint of all of our products, and we pushed it forward. Really, during that period in the pandemic, we did quite a lot to help hotels. And actually looking back, it's something that we are quite proud of as a company, because a lot of hotels would have actually had to shut if they couldn't run the whole property with one off-site staff member using our technology. And we actually raised capital off the back of that. Some hoteliers saying, I need to put money into this because you kept us in business. But that's one thing we did was the additive. I think they use them in the London Underground. Like if you're holding on, they've got that same additive in the paint so the germs can't easily pass someone else. But that was one interesting thing we did during the pandemic.
Yeah, that's a good story. It's good to know that is on the underground, because I got little children as well, and for the life of me, I can't stop my daughter from occasionally licking the handrails. And how do you see? So we're going a little bit off script here now, but I find it very fascinating, this sort of manufacturing in China, and then of course how the world has changed. And at MΗNUT, we spent a lot of resources. I would say starting in the first Trump administration, forget exactly the year, but with moving manufacturing, because we started seeing almost too much geopolitical risk with a supply chain that was very, very stretched out. How are you thinking about that for something like locks, which is obviously very high security? There's a lot of issues with ransomware, etc., and where maybe having a very tight grip on the supply chain is extra important.
Yeah, we had to do some parallel manufacturing. The other thing is that all the embedded engineering, so the developing of the PCBs and the motherboards and the writing the firmware, but we do all of that in Sydney now, and we actually do all of that production in Adelaide. So that's one thing, and then the actual assembly, the big sort of manufacturing component, we can do that in 3 different locations. So, and as you say, that's all about reducing geopolitical risks so that we can still get locks out the door.
So you've built resiliency through redundancy.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yes, we have. Yeah.
Yeah. One thing that I've always thought of in that sort of playbook is like the more you spend with a manufacturer, the better sort of negotiating position you have in terms of price and control, attention. And so especially when you're a small manufacturer, like it can be hard to like split up your manufacturing and your supply chain in with several redundant suppliers. So how did you think about that? Was there like a volume you hit where you felt like, okay, now we're at the pace where we can do it?
Well, I think part of the advantage that we have is splitting out the embedded component from the mechanical components. So that was one thing that we did, because essentially all that's happening in China is a lot of metal being put together. It's not as complicated as getting one agency to do the entire thing for you. And I think we got some advantages out of that. I mean, where we are today as a business is we have Goki, which is the hardware co. And then we have a kind of sub-brand, if you like, called Portal, which focuses purely on the software layer. And where we see growth and scalability is on the software side. So it's not just us putting out devices as we have been with Goki, but it's how can we become the universal access API, maybe in future for agentic AI, which I think is super exciting. But I guess the point that I'll be trying to make here is on the software side, that's infinitely more scalable than parallel manufacturing and geopolitical risks and building those things. That side for us at Goki is kind of done and ticking away. But where we see the real growth in the future is on the Portal side.
That makes a lot of sense. So when you're looking ahead to the future, how do you think that guest expectations will change around access, and how are you meeting that?
Yeah, I mean, good question. I think on the expectation level from guests, I think we're already there in a way. I mean, I think we mentioned the pandemic a moment ago. That's when expectations from guests really shifted, because we all got used to kind of scanning a QR code to check in everywhere we went. We were getting a coffee or going to a hotel. I think the three shifts that I would be quite confident about moving into the future is that keyless becomes default, not premium. Keyless won't be something that's put on a sort of distant and abstract 5-year digital strategy when you're communicating with a hotel. And you've seen that in job titles, actually. Before the pandemic, you'd speak to like a guy in IT, and now you're speaking to someone in charge of guest automation or someone in charge of guest experience. So you're seeing that. So the other thing I would say is on a regulatory level, UAE, what you're seeing is they're mandating keyless. Also in MΗNUT Vision 2030 in Saudi Arabia, they're not just building smart hotels, they're building smart cities. So on an expectation level, I think we're already there. Keyless is going to become default. I think the other thing I would say is around credentials, so access credentials. I think they're going to become kind of more portable. So right now, a hotel is going to issue your own digital key, but in a way that's like needing a separate credit cards for every shop that you go to. So I believe what we're going to see is a more unified identity layer, sort of repository of guest data, which is going to make it easier. That tap for the phone, that tap for the Uber, that's going to be the tap for the hotel as well. I think that's important. But you also mentioned privacy. Now, privacy is going to be the most important competitive differentiator. So as a guest, I think we're all increasingly aware of your trading data for convenience, not just in hotels, but just in everyday life. And I think properties that start to offer a more seamless experience without the surveillance piece necessarily assigned to it are going to command more premium positioning. That's kind of my feeling, those three shifts.
So who do you think will own that identity? Because I could sort of absolutely see what you're saying, that there should be like almost like a Visa or a MasterCard for access.
Yeah.
But of course, like those companies are now like extremely like they're systematic. They're almost like governmental,
Yes.
right? Like it's institutions at the level that takes decades to build.
Yes.
Does government even have a place here?
I think so. I mean, I think at the first level, the controller of data in a property is the reservation system, it's the PMS that the hotel use. Whereas people like me, although those satellites of third-party apps that funnel on the top of the PMS, we're all just processing data that comes from the PMS. So I think that's the first point. The PMS is going to remain the single source of truth and kind of the brains of the operation. But I think the point you make around governments is an important one, because I think what we'll start to see is the provisioning of access credentials being tied to some sort of government identification or verification of ID. Certainly in some regions, you see that today. We mentioned the UAE a moment ago, and you do have to verify against government databases in order to actually start surfacing things like access credentials. And I think that will become more commonplace. But I think that is a safety thing, right? Making sure that the right people are accessing the right areas. More what I was talking about is, as a user, how much are you willing to give up of your own data to make things more convenient? And I think that's more of a philosophical point, right? I mean, going back to the very beginning, 10 years ago of Goki, we got a lot of complaints back then because we kind of made the staff job easier. They were kind of scanning QR codes and it populated the PMS, and it was almost like they were working in a supermarket then, like things became very quick. But the customers were like, hold on a minute, I paid, like, why do I have to enter this environment, this TP environment, to check into my room? And the weird thing, actually, looking back, is that we had to introduce backup 4-digit door codes as well as using a phone as your key, so that guests didn't have to come in. They didn't have to use their phone as their key. But the download rate stays at around 100%. But it was just having the optionality of the door code, which stopped the complaining. They all wanted to use their phone, but they didn't want to be forced to do it. And we might see something similar, actually, with this surveillance and security and privacy issues with access moving forwards.
Yeah, that's such an interesting piece. Like, the human psychology sometimes trumps the tech considerations.
Yes.
I think it's a good point around sort of trading convenience for data, but I'm not sure if it's always very conscious. Like, I think that it can become a bit abstract, and it also changes over time. Like, expectations on privacy change over time, and I think as we go into, like you're speaking about, like an agentic future. There's almost no limit to what ChatGPT can know about you. I think it's going to be worse than Google in a way, because you're speaking to it almost like a friend sometimes. And so if you trust the agent to then give the right data to the third party, I think we might end up in an interesting place where we're going to see a lot of breaches and probably some scandals before there are enough guardrails and things put in. How are you thinking about that from your perspective?
Well, I think today you can't get a physical key through agentic AI. I think we are moving towards that area, and I think you're very right to actually raise some concerns around that. Not talking just about hospitality, but everyday life. But I think where we're moving to is that you can be in New York, you can say, tell me a good 5-star hotel that's design led, that you can pay for it, then it can spit out a key or an Apple Wallet provision, and you can use that. Massively convenient, no friction. What an amazing experience. But what have you given up along the way to get to that point is an interesting question, one that we don't fully know today, right? I mean, you can't do that today. I would say that on the reservation system side, and then on the processing side where the third-party apps exist, of course, there's levels of compliance we have to have with things like GDPR, and the ability for guests to have control over the data that they do share. Whether that continues into the future with things like agentic AI is yet to be seen, right? And I think on a personal level, we're going to have to be able to say, what is more important to me? Is it my personal data, or is it removing these friction points? Is it having a more convenient stay? And hopefully that's one that will be up to us to decide.
Yeah. One thing that we've observed, so we have, as MΗNUT, we of course have customers in the hotel space, but are the bulk of our customers in more short-term rentals. And if you're checking into a hotel with your family, they're more likely than not to ask for passports for everyone who is staying there, so you make sure you know who's in the building. But on the short-term rental side, the expectation is often quite different. You have places where you actually need to collect ID of everyone staying in the accommodation.
Yes.
for legal reasons. But oftentimes travelers from other cultures, they balk at that. They're like, I booked it.
Yes.
Why is it your issue, who I'm bringing into the short-term rental? And so I
Yeah.
find it interesting where you have sort of, different standards in different different industries, like from the guest point of view, and I'm wondering if those will persist, or whether it will all evolve to a place where we actually have a bit more regulation, or we have a bit more control.
I think the important point there is that you do have to give up a lot of data today just to check in. There's no world in which you can say, no, I'm not telling you my name or giving you any, these things have to be done not just from a government compliance standpoint, but they also have to be done for things like fire rating certifications. You need to be able to identify the people in the property. So we're never going to get to a world in which you don't give up any data to stay at a hotel, right? I mean, that's happening today. It will always happen, but I think it's just that balancing act of how much we give up as consumers and guests.
If you were starting Goki or Portal again today, what would you do differently?
Well, we first made a foray into this world about a decade ago, so quite a long time, and technology's changed massively over that period. I mean, really, the only way you could give someone a mobile key is on a native application using Bluetooth. Back then, there was no other way. But I think, not just thinking about the technology, but thinking about the business, I probably would have separated out the hardware from the software day one. I think that's something that we're benefiting from now. I mean, we were very lucky that we won the best keyless software at a company called Hotel Tech Report. Lots of hotels go to Hotel Tech Report to work out what tech stack they're going to deploy. And for the last 4 years, we've won the best keyless software, and that's what made us start thinking: should we decouple this from our devices? Should we give this keyless software available to other people using other devices that aren't necessarily Goki? So when we started, we thought there was real benefit in being kind of vertically integrated, and that was an advantage, controlling the full stack. But now we don't necessarily think. I think there's some lessons learned in Portal from Goki. The software layer, distinct from hardware, is probably one thing that I would have done straight away. The other thing I think, just when I mentioned technology being better today, Apple Wallet's going to become more mainstream, or Google Wallet as well. More browsers support Bluetooth protocols. So we wouldn't have had a decade of edge cases and sort of issues related to the technology. So that would have made life much easier, I think. But the main thing, just to answer your question, is separating out the hardware from the software, making the software available on an infrastructure level, not just selling devices with software attached.
So no dating app for backpackers.
We might go back to that idea. I mean, the funny thing is, we were at the time, I think Tinder had 500 million swipes a day. We're like, yeah, let's just build a dating app. No, the backpackers were using Tinder, so it was a very, very silly idea, but it did lead to something more compelling, I think. So we're thankful for that.
The most important thing is to get started.
Exactly.
Finally, I always like to hear some crazy stories, and everyone in hospitality has one. So what is the most unexpected thing that happened to you in your journey?
Well, I think really now we're a hotel business. I mean, about 70% of our customers are hotels, but hostels was where we started in the backpacking world. And there's a lot of crazy stories that I could tell you about backpackers, which may not actually be suitable for air. But before we'd even started, before we delivered even our first mobile key, and as we mentioned earlier, we've done 100 million now, but this is before number one. I think I had been a little bit overzealous in pitching the benefits of Goki and that whole Apple retail experience that we mentioned earlier. And we were pitching to a hotel that had 25 hotels across Australia and New Zealand. And before we'd even started, before we'd done our first mobile key, they took a sledgehammer to every single reception across all 25 hotels. And basically their rationale was, it's like, well, based on your product, we're just not going to need them anymore. And this isn't as, I am being literal here, that they did destroy all of their receptions. So all demolished. And being a young startup, there was a huge amount of pressure at that point to actually deliver on what we said that we could do. There was no fallback option for them or us. But the reason why I mentioned that one, not least because it was quite dramatic, but it's a moment that stuck with me as the founder, because it kind of captures both the terror and the validation of building something brand new, that a customer could be so confident in the technology or the vision of where we're heading that they physically destroy everything. And then, since then we've had plenty of like crazy installation stories. That we've had people installing locks upside down. We've had people installing locks on planks of wood that were temporary that are still there years later. I mean, hardware in the real world, as you know, has variables that no simulation can capture. But that nomads moment, the sledgehammer moments, is the one that I keep coming back to, because it's not really about technology. It's about trust. So trusting us with their business model. And the crazy thing is, they actually save tens of thousands of dollars a week from implementing Goki. So they believed in us, and we gave them the proof. So I was very happy with that story.
That's a great story. And another time I want to hear the ones that you wouldn't say on air.
We'll have that over a beer. We'll do that one over a beer, I think. You might need it.
Thanks so much for joining, Jack. It was a great conversation.
Thank you. Really enjoyed it.
Thank you for listening to Minute by Minute. If today's episode gave you fresh insight, be sure to subscribe on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, or YouTube. Share this episode with your team and follow us on social media to continue the conversation and exchange your own operational stories. To learn more about privacy-first property protection, visit MΗNUT.com. Until next time, make every minute count to maintain your property's safety.